Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Kale Zelden podcast. I'm here once again with my friend, Dr. Larry Chapp, and I'm able to sneak him in before he runs off to vacation of all things. Larry, how you doing?
Doing great. Just took my glasses off here because there was a lot of glare I
Sure.
saw on them. So I hope I don't scare anybody. But I'm doing great. Looking forward to vacation tomorrow. Heading out to
Yeah.
my home state of Nebraska, my home city of Lincoln, and gonna have fun.
Good, good. That's good. Yeah, wife and I are trying to get back to. My wife's from Chicago, and I'm from Louisiana, so we're trying to get back to our respective places at some point in the summer. We just finished up the school year here, and all of that. So anyway, well, look, we have avoided talking about this topic today for quite a while. I'm titling this session together "The Ordo of Apathy." And perhaps holiness as the antidote. But one of my friends on Facebook clipped a quotation from our last show, and I didn't remember saying this exactly, so it was one of those nice things where he captured the quotation, and this is what I said. So I'm going to be really vain and narcissistic here and quote
Go
back to
for it.
our audience what I said, and maybe it can be an entry into what we want to talk about today.
Yeah.
I said, we live in the Ordo of Apathy. The question is no longer does God exist or not exist, but does God matter? Which is a more profound and devastating question to consider and to confront. So I guess my first question to you is, of course, I'm getting this from you. This is, not unique to me, but what do we
Or
mean by
me.
Yeah, right. Who knows where these things come from, right? But
Yeah.
what do we mean by ordo, and what do we mean? Maybe I think more people understand what we mean by apathy, but maybe we can break that down too. But first of all, what do we mean by ordo, Larry?
By ordo, I mean simply the broad social structures of our culture, broadly speaking, that define who we are, that give us our narrative, that give us our worldview, what sociologists call our plausibility structures. That's a
Yeah,
sort of ordo. Our ordo would be the ordo of American style liberal democracy,
yeah,
capitalist economy,
hmm
certain notions of freedom and how
hmm
God relates to that. And then we institutionalize it in law,
hmm
government, and so on. So it's a rather vague term to say that we live in this ordo. It's
hmm
probably more accurate to say that we live within a nested hierarchy of various
hmm
ordos that all sort of interact with one another. Because certainly my Catholic faith gives me a
yeah,
certain ordered and structured
yeah.
life as well. So
But we're
that
Americans too. We're of a certain class. All those sort of things sort of come together to sort of constitute
right.
our ordo. Yeah, I'm reminded, just real quick to jump in here and maybe to sort of further muddy the waters. I'm reminded of Charles Taylor's conception of the social imaginary. As
Right.
this sort of, or maybe the German world view, Weltanschauung, whatever that is. But I like this idea of a plausibility structure. But it's the world in which we live and breathe. We live, breathe, move, have our being in. I think that's sort of the idea here.
Yeah.
So
And
what
there's no
about apathy?
escaping it completely either.
Right,
That's the
right, right.
important thing. We can try.
Right. What is it? We struggle. I sat through a couple of graduation speeches the past couple of weeks, and they were actually pretty good. I have to give real props to the speakers. And of course, I can't remember the names off the top of my head. But in one of them, the speaker admonished us um, uh, to do your best to read and to familiarize yourself of the time and of the moment, to read
Yes.
current and popular things, but also do a deep dive because you never want to be merely of your time, but you need to be able to have some sort of perspective on the time. And of course, there's no better way than to do a deep dive into the classics and the ancients as a sort of
And
way of
and
kind of
and and the
familiarizing yourself.
and the Catholic faith. Uh,
That's right. That's
some
right.
sort of, as Sorab Amari would say, some kind of tradition with a small t that we have to
Yeah,
immerse ourselves into in his latest book, The Unbroken Thread, which is
I
great.
love that.
Uh,
Yeah, that's great.
and
Yeah.
But also, I mean, to not put too fine a point on it because we need to move on. The best way
Yep.
to do that deep dive, I think, in terms of figuring out what is the ordo, the primary ordo in which you
hmm
live and move and have your being, is to ask
hmm
yourself the question: what ideas socially am I not allowed to criticize?
Yes, that. Hold on, I need to jump in here because I love this idea. One of my friends was posting something on one of the social media. I think it might have been Twitter, but it's like there was the admonition by a sort of a cultural commentator to follow the silence. You know, what are the things you can't talk about?
Right.
That's really an inflection point of some sort.
Yes, I think that's absolutely. I mean, it's not infallible, but I think it's a good
No,
starting point. And
yeah,
obviously, there are some things we should not pursue and we should be silent about, and with good reason. But then there are other things which maybe don't have good reasons.
yeah. So, all right. So, why apathy? What, you know, you've spent a good amount of time talking about the de facto atheism that you sense, and I think that's
Yeah,
rich and right. But apathy is that's sort of next level, isn't it?
yeah. It's it's sort of indifference on steroids. And it's different than it's different than the old fashioned what the spiritual writers call acedia,
Right.
acedia, which is a sort of spiritual boredom that often is simply one stage in the spiritual life, in the purgative way, as you seek
Yeah.
union with God. And many of the saints have suffered through this sort of noonday devil, this acedia, this sort of
Yeah. Yeah.
inertia that sets in. Apathy is completely different. Apathy would say more than I'm bored with this. Apathy would say none of this matters. None of this matters at all. And there's an indifference to it that therefore the lends an unreality to it. In one of my blog posts, I talk about how the modern world is characterized not by disbelief in God, but the unreality of God, as if the question of God doesn't even matter. I think we mentioned last time, wasn't there just recently a Pew study of millennials that said 48 to
Yeah.
50% of millennials don't even consider the question of God to be of any relevance whatsoever? You know, that's different than, say, the thundering atheism of a Nietzsche or something like that, where you're sort of
Right. Yep.
implicitly affirming what it is you're denying, because at least with some venom, you are affirming the importance of the question. You are affirming that the God question actually matters. Apathy is a far different game. It's to say the question doesn't even matter. And there's an implication, too, that you're kind of a silly person to even bring the question up. You're a potential fascist for even bringing the question up.
For sure. Yeah. No, I think that you know, because I think those voices that would call you and I sort of proto
Sure.
fascists for even concerning ourselves with the question of God and origins and purpose and telos and all of those things that you and I like to talk about. That not only that, but we're sort of the jackboots. You know, we're sort of the thugs, the brown shirted thugs, ready to
Yeah.
impinge upon their blessings of liberty, as our friend Sarab would say, right? And you know, which is I think interesting, and the thought just occurred to me here as we're talking. That is, you know, this sort of strange projection that goes on. You know, that for these folks to call us, you know, sort of the fascist, the proto-fascist thugs is, I think, number one, I don't think that's true.
No.
Obviously, I feel like I
I
should have to
hope
say
I'm
that
not
out
a
loud,
fascist.
but I don't think that's true. But I also think, you know, if you sort of have any sense of your eyes being open and watching the current scene, it's the other way around. It's those people that would call you and I, you know, sort of theocratic thugs, are themselves theocratic thugs.
Yes.
Either they don't know it or they won't admit it.
This goes to the question too of, you know, the old debate about confessional states, creedal states, and how
Yeah.
we have to avoid any sort of cooperation between church and state, because as soon as that happens, you end up with theocracy and repression, and so it's better to have non-confessional states. Well, newsflash: all states are confessional. All states are
Yeah.
ultimately
Right.
creedal,
All yeah.
because they
Yeah. All states are confessional because everybody worships.
yeah, everybody worships something. You're simply the only question is the quality of what it is that you're worshiping. We all have our
Yeah.
God.
That's
Some of
exactly right.
us worship the one
That's right.
infinite
That's right.
God of love and charity and justice and joy. Others worship the lesser gods, the strong gods, if you will, of nationalism and
Yeah.
ethnicism and race and so on. And this is the fear that these that these strong gods are making a return. What was it Chesterton once said? It's when people stop believing in God, it's not that they now believe
Yeah.
in nothing, it's that they will believe in anything. And
In anything.
and
Yeah.
the danger is that all as we kill off the one god, all of these smaller gods will rush back in. The cult of blood and soil, of Blut und Erde, the cult of
Yeah.
race, and so on.
That's
And
right.
that is the truly dangerous theocracy. And what is identity politics and woke culture if not the return of these strong gods?
No, I think that's right, and I think Douthit made the Ross Douthit, New York Times columnist, made the comment. Gosh, now several years ago, but he said, if you think if you are concerned about the religious right, wait until you get a load of the irreligious right. Or the non-religious right. In other words, it's those strong gods come
Yeah.
back and they are vengeful. But I don't. It's not just a matter of the right. I mean, I think that what also needs to be acknowledged are the strong gods of the left, and I think that identity
Yes.
politics is playing in these waters, and I'm always left wondering how aware are they of this? When you lose the I am who am, you insert versions of ourselves into the mix. So the pantheon of the Greek gods, for instance. If you know anything at all about Greek mythology or Norse mythology or Egyptian theology, like the gods are nasty dudes, man. They are
Yes.
not. They are not good, as we might say, good. They're bastards, and they're powerful, and they're not
No, they're
reasonable.
capricious.
Yeah, yeah. Right, what is it? The
They're
capricious.
capricious.
Yeah,
They're
that's exactly right.
arbitrary. In some ways, one could
Yeah.
say, if you look back at many of the gods of ancient mythology, what they represent are personified projections of the forces, the elemental forces of existence.
The
So
self.
there's an
Yeah,
apotheosis
that's right.
of these
That's right.
elemental forces of existence. But as Arnold Toynbee, a historian of religion, said, in the early 20th century,
Mhm.
nature is both mother and monster, and is largely indifferent to
Yeah,
us. And so the
yeah,
ancient gods, as
yeah.
projections of these elemental natural forces, are both mother and monster. And it's go ahead.
Well, and what's so fascinating me? No, what's so fascinating to me about this is that even someone like Freud very much
Yes.
understood this idea. If you look in Civilization and Its Discontents, he basically says, "Yeah, like I've prattled on for my entire career about repression and the problems of repression, but man, if we don't have repression, we don't have civilization." And so he understood that these dark forces, these chthonic forces that populate us, using
Yes.
his sort of his landscape, his structure of the soul. Watch out. These are dark and formidable
Yeah.
forces, and we play with this at our peril. And I don't even think Freud fully appreciated what he meant by all of this. I do think I don't know if you've ever read any Camille
Oh, yes.
Paglia, but in
Yeah.
sexual persona, especially the first two chapters, and I recommend to my readers. You're not going to agree with everything
No.
Camille Paglia says, but you have to contend with the vision that she sketches out of the Apollonian, the Dionysian, that she sketches out, and she leans pretty heavily on Freud. But she talks about this, like the Galilean has done much to tame our darker forces, both personally and culturally. And getting rid of such things is not so much the path of our liberation, but really rather the path of liberation for dark and bloody
No, that is so
forces.
true, and it's one of the things that I've always respected about Camille Paglia, even though I strongly, obviously, disagree with many of her conclusions.
Yep.
She's deeply
Yep.
insightful in this matter, and it is also very
And she's
brutally
honest,
honest,
and
and,
she's
and it's
honest.
also a tremendous misreading of Freud to see him as simply a champion of sort of Epicurean, Sybarite, Dionysian
That's
sort of
that's right.
unleashing of
That's right.
everything. He
That's so true.
understood what he was perhaps unleashing. So, yeah, these strong gods are very are threatening in the face of our apathy towards the one God to return, and that's the point. We can't we
Hmm.
we're not going to remain in stasis. We can have an apathy towards the one God, but we're not going to remain apathetic towards all gods because human beings are homo adorans. We are worshiping animals, and we will
Yeah,
worship something.
that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. All right. Now, how do we tie this into? So we've been talking about the Ordo, or this sort of plausibility structure that seems to be characterized, at least in our world, right, in the United States, in the North American United States, with a kind of apathy, a kind of like shoulder shrug, a kind of cultural phlegmatic standpoint. And so we care more about, the hockey playoffs than we care about, what we're here on this planet for. I'm curious to know what you think, or your sort of opinion. Like, how does this happen? I mean, how does apathy set in? If on the one hand we are creatures that are made to worship, or adapted to worship, or created to worship, depending upon your own framework or plausibility structure, how do we lose that sense? I mean, how have we
I think
lost
to
that sense?
a large extent it has to do with a gradual and slow but inexorable substitution of ultimate things with penultimate things. In a traditional Catholic sort of view or classical view, it was always very much before everybody's eyes that ultimacy was our goal, transcendence was our goal, and because
Mm,
people
mm,
were not
mm.
materially affluent or well off, most people were peasants and were scraping a
Right.
hand to mouth
Yeah.
existence as best they could, and death was at the door, disease was at the door. So there was a tremendous and powerful emphasis on ultimacy over penultimacy. But with the rise, and I write about this a lot, with the rise of industrialization in the modern world and capitalism and modern science and democracy and so forth, the emphasis shifted from ultimacy to penultimacy, to the idea of what I call bourgeois
Yeah.
well-being, and that's not an idea of mine. I get that from
Yeah.
Berdyaev and Augusto Del Noce and Dorothy Day,
Hmm.
among others. The modern culture is defined
Yeah.
as a sense
Yeah.
of bourgeois middle-class well-being, affluence, having all the material comforts of life,
Hmm.
really are
Hmm.
now what define us. They become the be all and end all of our
Yeah.
existence, unto which we then sprinkle a little Jesus pixie dust on the top. Uh,
That's right. That's right. A little veneer, a little veneer of
and
Jesus
as I like
sauce,
to
and then
say
we're
too,
sort
you
of all
wonder then
good,
how
right? Yeah.
deep the Jesus faith actually goes. And this is what I mean about an ordo, about plausibility structures.
Mm,
What is it that
mm,
truly governs our life? What is it that we truly worship? And in our culture, it is material well being, even if intellectually might say to ourselves, no, I know that this is not right. I have to pay attention to
right.
Jesus and so on. You don't really mean it, not in your heart, not in your
Hmm.
soul, and it comes through in
Right.
how you
And
act,
right.
where your
Yeah.
faith is just sort of tacked on, like you said, as a veneer on the top, and it's sort of Jesus sprinkles on the ice cream, the secular ice cream, and over time. I mean, these we used to call these, in a sense, sins of the flesh, if you will, greed, lust, so on,
Right.
and
Right. Right.
St. Paul
Lust.
makes
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
clear you're not going to inherit the kingdom of God if you're wallowing in worldly things.
Yeah.
Worldliness robs us of spiritual sight and then eventually robs us of spiritual desire. So worldliness leads to that apathy.
Good, good. I like that jump. Otherworldly sight robs us of otherworldly desire, and I think that desire has
Yes,
played such a crucial role in this because we tend to baptize desire as if it's almost like a
yes,
platonic form, right? And you and I both know that desire is a squishy, ineffable,
yes.
fungible, movable, changeable protean thing. It's always shifting, it's always changing, and yet we say, well, I want it, therefore it is, and it's like it's not that simple. Our desires are
Yeah.
powerful forces, right? And I do think that's important for us to recognize that our desires are powerful forces, but we can't simply be
That
slaves to our desires. I mean, we
This
we,
is the
we
key. Yeah,
must
you
be
can't
better than that,
simply,
right?
we're not talking a sort of dualistic Manichaean scheme here where worldly things are bad and only spiritual things are good.
Right,
Because that's going to lead to a
right,
sort of white knuckled, world hating asceticism that in the end
yeah,
undercuts,
yeah,
undercuts ultimacy to begin with. Because it's precisely, in some
right,
sense, the church's
right,
adoption of this kind of world denying asceticism that led to people kind of rejecting it and saying, well, my Catholic faith or whatever tells me that I'm supposed to hate XYZ and only love these things, so ABC. And we found that that ultimately was a repression of our desires. The goal ultimately is to transform our desires, because if all we have is desire, you eventually lose desire itself. This is where boredom sits in. Pope Benedict talks about this in his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, where he compares eros and agape.
He does,
and he points out that unless eros is fulfilled in agape, if all you have is eros, eventually you lose eros too. Eventually our desire. Go ahead.
And I want to jump in. I think all of us have an exact. We know exactly what this feels like, right? And we've all done this, I'm sure, right? Which is you go onto the internet. Let's see, you wake up in the morning, you do your morning routine, you have your coffee, go on a walk, whatever. You come back and you fire up the computer and you fire up the browser, right? And you do your little routine, right? And I'll go to this news site and then that news site. I'll pop on Facebook. I'll look at Twitter, look at Instagram. And then I'll hit CNN.com. And then I'll, hit Rod's blog and your blog and Steve's blog and all my friends. And I'm just sort of, and then I don't know. And then I'm kind of well, what about this? And what about, and so what? I'm 2.5 hours into this completely almost unconscious thing. And I'm I've got nothing else to do. And I'm just sort of I guess I'll look at that site again. In other words, because it's because it's not ordered toward something more, right? I'm just browsing, as the browser would suggest. It's not ordered towards something specific. You actually run out of desire, and then sort of this, as you called it, acedia kind of sets in, and you no longer know what you're here for. And so that little mini drama, I think, is a perfect sort of stand-in for what you're getting at here. And so I think you can jump in here, but I want our audience to understand, you and I both fully understand that we are throwing rocks from glass houses on this. It's we are just as prone to the Ordo of Apathy
as I say in almost all my blog posts where I talk about this. The reason why I talk about it so much is I'm infected with the same bacillus as everybody else. I'm a leper talking to other lepers. I have that. I was raised a middle-class kid in Lincoln, Nebraska, with all the typical American values, middle-class values, and I have spent my entire life living within that ordered structure of I have to have this car insurance and this medical insurance and this retirement plan and this sort of base income and this house in this neighborhood and these kinds of cars. And then you wake up one day and realize that none of that ultimately means diddly-do. Talk to anybody who works, for example, in hospice, and and people never ever sit in their deathbed complaining about whether or not they should have gotten one more car before. It's all about their relationship.
Or even I wish I had contributed another extra $150 a month into my 401k.
But the phenomenology of our internet usage that you just described is me to a T. I was laughing hysterically inside because whenever I'm getting to a point here, which is whenever I have leisure time on my hands. So obviously I'll do a lot of reading of real books and that sort of thing, but that's usually now at my age simply because I'm ordered to a task. So I'm writing some books of my own, or right now I am, and I'm also blogging. Well, I don't want to sound like a bloomin' fool, so I better read some stuff, real stuff. And so because I have those tasks that I do desire to complete, I read books. But when I'm in my leisure mode, when I'm saying, okay, I've done reading that, now I'm just going to relax. What do? I sit in a chair and I surf the internet on my iPad. And I will do that for hours. Hours. And even after I've said to myself, I'm bored out of my brains. I can't watch one more YouTube video, and I can't watch one more Facebook conversation. And yet I set it aside, and 10 minutes later I'm right back at it.
There you go. Right back to it. No, it's so oddly compulsive. Look, this is, and the reason why, of course, is it works. It gives us some sort of dopamine hit. It's drug. It functions in us the way that a drug does. And even you and I, we are both men who understand that these algorithms are very powerful, and that we know that we must transcend our own algorithm, and yet there we are. It's compulsive. It's really no different than a drug. It's really no different than that plate of
That's the key.
brownies sitting across the way here on the
It's just a
counter.
different kind
It's
of
just you
dopamine
want to
hit.
go
I
do
think
it.
that's exactly right. It's just as, in a sense, worldly and numbing down of our spiritual senses as drinking too much or watching
Good.
porn too
That's
much
right.
or eating too much or whatever all those other vices are that
Right.
worldly
That's right.
sink us down. The internet can be that too, which is why lately I've imposed upon myself a very strict ascetic of limiting how much time I actually spend on the internet. And it is amazing how much more
Mm.
work I'm getting done in productive ways. And then here's the key: how much happier I am,
Yeah. Yeah.
how much more internal. All of your
Yeah.
viewers
Right.
understand how rewarding it is when you complete a task that you know you are supposed to complete and you complete it well. And it is something of
Supposed to do.
merit
That's
and
right.
value. And you sit back and it brings you
Yeah.
actually great contentment, peace, joy to complete such tasks. Whereas it does not bring you
Totally.
commensurate joy at all to simply while away your hours doing all kinds of dissipating things, whether it's the internet or otherwise. So I'm not arguing for some sort of Protestant work ethic here, but there is something about
Right.
managing the
Right.
talents that Christ gave us, that God gave us, and not allowing what the most
Yeah.
precious gift we
Well,
have is
and I think
time.
that
Yeah,
right. That's all we have. Literally, that's all we have. Right. And then the attention that we
yes,
pay. I love that word, pay. We pay attention to those things that
yes,
are actually important. And thus the ordo, right, this word we keep going back to, is that it's ordered towards something beyond ourselves, beyond a
yes.
satiation of my desires, right, that it has to be bigger. So, okay. So look, so we understand this ordo of happiness, and yet you and I are Catholics, and we believe that we have been gifted with the good news. And so the good news, it seems to me, or the antidote to this ordo of apathy, is the call,
Yes.
the call to heroism that I think you really do a good job of bringing out. So why is heroism the antidote
It's
to
heroism
apathy?
is one way to put it, and I think it's perhaps the best way to put it because it inherently implies that what you're engaging in is an act of courage. Heroism requires courage, fortitude,
Right.
and various virtues that we've long considered good things to
Yeah.
have. And it's an antidote to apathy because one
They're
of the
they're they're
attributes of
cardinal.
apathy,
They're
all
cardinal
right, is
after
that
all.
it causes us to focus in upon ourselves and then eventually simply to collapse in upon
Mm,
ourselves so that our
mm,
very
mm,
self itself collapses into something meager and small, attenuated, and so on.
mm.
Joseph Pieper wrote a great book, The Leisure, the Basis of Culture, in the 20th. And what it
I
points
was
to
just
is
going
the
to bring him
fact
up.
of two
Ah, I love
differing
it. Love
notions
it.
of
Yeah.
what we mean by leisure. There's the modern secular bourgeois notion of leisure is okay, I'm done with work now, making money. So now I get to do
Mhm.
Disney World or the internet or, play golf or whatever. Whereas people, and those are all decent things. It's not the point. But Pieper
Mhm.
points out for a Christian, and
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
classical sense, leisure is now the time that has been gifted to you, if you will, to develop yourself, to develop your internal resources, to perhaps pray more,
Right.
to engage in art appreciation more, and to
Yeah.
engage in relationships more, not then to collapse into various entertainments and that kind of thing. And so the point is, heroism is that aspect of our
So,
leisure that calls us to something higher, to something bigger. As soon as we are done with the quotidian tasks of day to day life, whatever job we have, whatever I have to do to put food on that table, to take care
yeah.
of my family,
Yeah.
for some of us, we have the great
Sure.
blessing of
Sure.
having our quotidian job coincide with our vocation. But for many people, that is not true. Their jobs are simply
Yeah.
drudgery, and I
Right. Right.
understand that. But that only underscores the fact that when you are no longer doing that,
Hmm.
you are now freed up to do something courageous, to do something heroic, to do more than simply, I'm not working right now. And therefore, I'm just going to entertain myself right now. And that requires an act of
Right.
courage because it's fun to have fun. You know, it's desirable to simply sit back and
Yeah.
entertain
Yeah.
yourself
Right. Yeah.
rather than to see it as a challenge to move up the ladder of existence higher and higher and higher in the spiritual life in particular, but that would also be in terms of your literary pursuits, your artistic pursuits, your relational pursuits, various avocational artisanal skills that you might pick up. You know, like my wife teaches people how to spin wool. We have sheep. She now spins,
Mhm.
processes fleece, shears the sheep, teaches,
Yeah.
you know, kids how to spin wool. And that's a real tactile skill that she teaches people that brings great fulfillment. That in one sense is entertaining, but in another sense is very elevating to
Right.
master that kind of a craft. I know
Yeah.
we're not really talking about heroism as such here,
Yeah.
but
No, I
it's
think that's
related.
go ahead. Go ahead. Hmm. Yeah, well, I think heroism is embodied, and I think that what you're anticipating is this sort of incarnational
Yes.
calling we have to embody our ideals, right? To body forth the truth. I guess I don't want to be cheesy about this, but why do our betters, right? You quoted Casper. And Casper basically says, "Well, tough situations. It's really too much to
Yeah.
call people to holiness or heroism. We're just going to have to, we should just be a little bit merciful." And I mean, so what is the conflict there? Why do our betters want
Well,
us to
I
be
think, well, first
comfortable
off,
rather
I
than
want
to
to
be
preface by saying that
challenged?
I actually admire Cardinal Casper. I've been a reader of his theology books since I was a young man. He's actually a brilliant theologian. And I don't want to be overly critical of him, but that statement he made
Hmm.
before the synod on the family, where he said, well, we can't expect too much of average
Yeah,
Christians. That kind of heroism isn't for average Christians. I thought was appalling. And it bespeaks what's entirely wrong with what's going on in the German church right now. And
yeah,
by the way, Cardinal Casper, just last week, came out with some very critical statements about the German synodal way. But anyway, um,
yeah.
now,
I saw that. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and I'll just quote just for our listeners. He says, "I have high respect for those who are trying to live together as brother and sister, but it is a heroic act, and heroism is not
it
for
is
the
what set me
average
off because you
Christian."
know what? I'm
And that's
actually
really what I think set
sympathetic
you off,
to
right?
the point he was making, which is, and even Pope Benedict
Yeah.
said this: the Church has to take a good, long, hard look at the annulment process and how
Yeah.
we deal with divorced and remarried Catholics in a culture so saturated with divorce. And, in full disclosure. I
Hmm.
mean, I'm
Hmm.
divorced and remarried with the benefit of a church annulment, and so I don't want to be a
Hmm.
hypocrite and deny to others what was granted to me, an act of great mercy from the church. And so I'm actually not one of these.
Yeah.
I'm so opposed to Amoris Laetitia because of that footnote where the Pope gives a wink and a nod to divorce. I, I don't entirely
Right.
agree with changing a
Right.
certain
Right.
church
Right.
discipline vaguely and ambiguously in a footnote. Nevertheless, I think he's onto something important. So my point is,
Right.
yeah, I'm sympathetic to what Casper was saying, but the manner in which he
Hmm.
concludes from this, well, we can't expect average people to be heroic like this. I think is appalling. I couldn't.
Well, you not only do you think it's appalling, but you believe it's an inversion of
Yes,
the
because
heroic, the essential
well,
heroic call of the faith.
because ultimately the call
How
of the
so?
faith is a yes or a no. Jesus vomits the lukewarm out of his mouth. There's a reason why it is the church of Laodicea in the book of Revelation that is the one that
Yeah, yeah,
Jesus
yeah, yeah.
vomits out of his mouth. The lukewarm,
Right, right.
you're either, as C.S. Lewis said, we're like eggs spiritually, and we're meant to hatch. You either hatch or you go bad. There's no stasis. There's no standing still. And so,
Yeah,
what Cardinal Casper's comments seem to
yeah,
imply, what I mean
yeah.
by this inversion, is that we have to presume that the very bourgeois culture in which modern people live is the standard. That's the norm that we can expect of people. That is,
Hmm.
in a sense, the script that we have to follow. And the gospel is meant to flip all such scripts. The gospel is meant to, in a sense, worm its way in and undermine all such scripts and to call people up higher. And if you don't call people up higher, you leave them where they are, and that is not mercy. To leave people where they are is not mercy. It's actually it's an act of indifference. Ultimately, it's another
What
species
is it?
of apathy. So, in some sense, kindness is different from mercy.
Mm-hmm.
And I applaud Cardinal Casper's constant talking about mercy because that's good. But as C.S. Lewis points out, kindness is a subset of mercy. Kindness is a disposition which is most times good. But if kindness is divorced from
Mm-hmm.
truth, and a concern for real mercy, real charity towards someone you care about, then kindness can simply become a kind of condescending and patronizing indifference to another person. To simply, someone who comes up to me and says, I'm a recovering alcoholic, let's go get a drink. If I would say, well, okay, I'm with you, buddy, let's go have some fun. I'll buy you some drinks and sit there and drink and have fun.
Yeah, yeah,
In
right,
some sense, I'm being kind to him. In another sense, I'm being absolutely
right.
cruel, absolutely indifferent, absolutely crushingly. Well,
Oh,
absolutely, and so
you're giving him the dagger
it's
to jump on top
oftentimes
of. I mean,
kindness of
that's
that
the
kind is simply oftentimes a veiled contempt, and that is what I see behind so much of many liberal Catholics when they start
well,
talking about what we cannot expect of people to live. These gospel standards are too high, and that's been said about the Sermon on the Mount for millennia, that you can't live the Sermon on the Mount. It's meant for the evangelical councils. It's meant for people in religious orders. It's not meant for average people. But as we read in people like Survey Pincars and modern moral theologians, this is absolutely not true. The
right,
Sermon on the Mount is the kingdom ethic of Christ, and it is very demanding. Christianity is demanding, which is also why it also demands true mercy and forgiveness. Because it's demanding, we're all going to
right,
fall short, so we must be merciful and forgiving towards one another.
right.
But that's different than a kind of insouciant kindness that simply says, let's not make the demands in the first place. That's an inversion of the gospel.
Well, yeah, yeah. And what strikes me so much is like
Yes.
and I feel like I know this as a father, like as an actual father, right? It's like to hear someone like Cardinal Casper, and again, I'm not trying to get nasty here. I'm just reacting to what he said, and perhaps it was unconscious on his part to be charitable. But to have one of your fathers say, it's probably a little bit too much for you. I mean, that becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of oblivion. And in other words, if he
Yeah.
says
Yeah.
it's
Well done.
impossible, my gosh, like why am I wasting any time doing any of this stuff? It's like if I'm at the house, and it's like I don't know. Let's say it's 3:45 in the afternoon, and my kid comes to me and says, "Daddy, can I have some chips?" And I'm sitting there thinking, like, well, you know, dinner's going to be at 5:30, 6 o'clock. Maybe he can have a little bit, and if I look at him and say, and if I look at him and say, well, you probably can't last until dinner. Well, guess what? He's going to go grab the bag of chips and down the whole thing. But instead, if I say, look, son, I know you're hungry. I'm a little hungry
Yeah.
too. Let's kind of hold off until we all gather at 6 o'clock. That little act of me holding the line, so to speak, even though I might be hungry too, and I am because I'm always hungry. It's a sort of it's a small little death to self that inspires. He's like, and if you say something like, "Look, son, I'm hungry too,
And you're
but let
calling your
us
son
both,
up
you and I,
to something higher, to a
let us hold
regulative
off.
discipline.
Let's see if we can do this."
And we, as you said, we've all done
That's
this as
exactly
parents. You
right.
become overly indulgent, overly indulgent,
Yeah.
overly indulgent, and you're not doing your child any favors by simply indulging
Yeah.
their every
Right.
desire because you're
Right.
not teaching them delayed gratification, developing of skill sets for
Right.
managing your desires, and so on. And to bring it
Right.
back to square one, an indulgent church
Right.
does nobody any favors either, which is my point. You're either
Hmm.
calling people to holiness
Right.
or you are simply indulging their desires and their mediocrity, which ultimately leads to their destruction. And I don't mean hell. I just mean their
Yeah.
anomie, the ennui and angst and sort of
Yeah.
dissipated life that we all feel when we start living like that. The church cannot indulge in that level. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, the slot. Yeah, it's the slouching that you talk about, right? And and I think this goes back to again this sort of discussion that we've been having about apathy. It's like you asked the question, like, what do I care about a first century rabbi? I mean, like, what's the relevance of that to me? And I get it, right? It's like, well, what do you mean I got to get up on Sunday morning? I'll sleep in, thank you very much, and I'll hit brunch later on, and I'll be fine because there's jazz and champagne and salmon and everything's good, right? So I think it's the missing of the boat of relevance, the inability to convey relevance that I think is really so bad.
Yeah,
Not so
that is
much
so
as you
key. As
say, like
people say, you
hellfire
know,
and
people
brimstone,
don't
but
go to
like,
church
why
anymore
does this
because we
even
stopped preaching
matter?
about hell, and nobody believes in eternal damnation anymore. And I said, okay, fine, we'll have that conversation. But in reality, the deeper problem is nobody believes in heaven anymore. Nobody believes in anything truly supernatural anymore. This goes back to what I was talking about, is the transference
Right,
from
right,
ultimate to penultimate realities as the day-to-day focus
right, right.
gradually dumbs down our spiritual senses to the point where we
Mm,
no
I love
longer
that.
even see the relevance of Jesus. And it certainly doesn't help then when you have a church which in great measure over the past 50 or 60 years
Right,
has indulged in the same thing in her theology,
right,
in her pastoral
right.
practice, in her homiletics, her preaching, her music, her liturgy. Everything has been geared towards this feel-goodism, this worldliness, and sort of doesn't feel good at all. And people walk away in droves
That
because
that
Bishop
that
Barron
doesn't
calls it
actually feel
beige
very good, does
Catholicism.
it?
It's boring. It's boring
Yeah,
Catholicism. It's the Catholicism I
yeah,
grew up
and
with.
he's
Once
right.
again, so I'm infected with this bacillus. It's in my bones. When I was a teenager, I was so bored with church, it was unbelievable. I
Yeah,
couldn't understand why anybody would find anything interesting or intriguing. And it was precisely because it was a church that wasn't calling me to heroism. It's instructive. I discovered my vocation. I eventually went to seminary. I thought I had a vocation to be a
hmm,
priest, but I discovered that quest, that ideal, that heroic zeal when I attended the Newman Center at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, where
yeah,
there was a very dynamic and profound priest who ran that Newman Center, who actually then was calling us to heroism. And youth, college age youth is the time for such a call. You're looking for what you're going to do with your
right.
life. You're looking for what you want to attach yourself to. That is
Yeah,
precisely where the church needs to be hammering away at this heroic message. And this priest was doing that. And Lincoln was getting vocations like crazy out of that. The year I went into the seminary, I think there
wow.
were like 23 Lincoln guys that went into the seminary that year. Now,
Hmm.
we obviously didn't make it, but that's because people were responding to that heroic call. Whereas a church that
Hmm.
indulges and dumbs down and in a sense doesn't what this priest did was he focused on the supernatural. He focused on the eschatological inbreaking of the kingdom, which is why I talk in some of my
Right.
blog posts about how we've lost our. I got this from Giorgio Agamben, where he says we've lost our eschatological nerve. If you read, yeah, I read your question.
Yeah, good. You anticipated exactly. Yeah. Yeah, break that down. I love
Yeah, I
that
mean,
phrase, that
Agamben and others,
eschatological nerve.
even
Can you
Bernardo sort of
flesh
as a
that out a
pointed out,
little
if
bit
you
for
read the New
us?
Testament, especially the Pauline corpus, what you see is a profound awareness
Uh-huh.
that we Christians are living in a different kind of time. No longer you're living in worldly time, but not really. You're in the world, but not of it. We are living in messianic time.
Mm,
We are living in that space between the first coming of Christ and the second.
right.
All right, and of course,
Right.
in classical eschatology theology, the theology of, in a sense, the last things. There's the realized and eschatology and the eschatology of the not yet. Okay, so we have the gifts of
Yeah.
the Holy Spirit now. We can have a foretaste of heaven and hell and the things to come now, a foretaste of them. But the ultimate fulfillment of all those things is, of course, in the parousia when Christ comes again.
Hmm.
And you can err in one direction or another of simply saying, well, we
Yep.
don't have any taste of heaven now. We just push that off into the future. Or say it's all a realized eschatology and I don't care about the future. But in reality, I think,
Yeah.
yeah,
Can I interrupt? Can I interrupt? And those listeners and viewers who've seen the movie Babette's Feast, you have a perfect illustration of a community that
Yes.
has elected that none of the foretaste exists here, that it's all deferred toward the end, and what they ultimately lose is the raison of their community. The love that binds them, the joy, the celebration, the contemplation that binds
Oh, no,
them,
it's true.
and
And
it's
it's
the feast that
precisely
triggers
this
that or
inbreaking of
reawakens
the
that
here and
in them.
now
But
of
anyway, so
heaven, of
go ahead.
these eschatological supernatural
Yeah.
realities here and now, which help to transform, as you see in Babette's Feast, and sacramentalize our fundamental desires. To bring it back to the beginning of our conversation, eros without
Mm-hmm.
agape
Mm-hmm.
eventually stops even being eros. So a meal with friends and
Yeah.
family that isn't quasi sacramental eventually
Eros.
stops
It's
being in
amazing.
any way, shape, or form even an enjoyable meal. You have to elevate in order to transform. And the earliest Christians understood deeply how, in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
palpable God's supernatural grace was, especially in the sacraments, especially in the Eucharist. So, my point is, and here I agree with the traditionalists 100%, despite some of my disagreements with them, the demolition of the liturgy after Vatican II, and Pope Benedict is right on this. The demolition of the liturgy after Vatican II was essentially the demolition of that eschatological inbreaking. If there is one thing you knew from the old Mass, was you were in the presence of something supernatural that is breaking in
Yeah.
now. That every Eucharist is a breaking of wineskins. Every Eucharist is a ripping
Mm-hmm.
of the veil between the here and the then, a ripping of the
Yeah.
veil between the world and the
Of
supernatural.
the
You
veil.
knew
The
that
veil. Yep.
in the old liturgy. In the new Mass,
Mm-hmm. And isn't that the feeling you get? Like, I was talking to Rod about this the other day, Rod Dreer, and he hopped into, a church. I think it was in Bucharest, Romania, and it's one of these sort of beautiful Orthodox churches. And you sort of walk in, and all of a sudden you
right.
realize that you're in a space that is just right up against the veil of the supernatural. It's like the veil is so thin that you really are you're jumping back and forth between the numen and the phenomena. You are in that holy space, that set aside space. And you know it. You were
Yeah.
immediately transported. So much different than to sort of riff on the beige Catholicism idea that Barron talks about. You walk into a modern suburban church and it's
It's
like,
insane.
is this an
Beauty will
IKEA
save
or
the
is
world if
this a
you
church?
understand
Because I
what
kind
beauty
of really
means.
can't
It's
tell the
exactly what you
difference.
just said. When you walk into a church, you should be
Yeah.
aware of
But anyway,
walking
yeah,
into a sacred space,
yeah,
a space where the veil
yeah,
between heaven and hell, I mean,
yeah.
between heaven and this world, but between the supernatural and natural,
Right,
that veil has been thinned. You should have
right,
that palpable sense when you walk
right.
into a church. And you are exactly right. So many modern churches, you do
Yeah,
not get
yeah,
that
good.
sense in the slightest. In fact, you get the opposite sense. You get a sense of absolute worldliness. And what's the deal with this modernistic architecture now of
Yeah,
concrete and steel, where everything is so Spartan?
yeah.
It's like a new Calvinism. It's a different way of whitewashing our church.
It's the
You're
it's the
exactly
machine.
right,
I
Kale.
think it's
That
worse.
is what
I think it's
strikes
worse
me
than that. I
too.
think it's the
Somebody on
aesthetics of
Facebook
the
that posted a
machine.
picture of a brand new church somewhere, and it's all concrete and angular structures and geometric, and it's like it is. It reminded me of the inside of some kind of a machina, of a
Steel.
machine of some kind, and this is palpably demonic, if you ask me. It's not even vaguely
Yeah.
demonic. I think it's palpably demonic.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, both Tolkien and Lewis, of
Yes.
course, knew this and write about this. And Paul Kingsnorth is talking about the
It
sort of
all
the
has to do with
aesthetics
what I mean
and
to. This
the
is what
Ordo of the
happens when the church
Machina,
loses her
if you will.
eschatological
I
nerve.
think
When
it's
she
on
stops
purpose. It's on
focusing,
purpose.
when
It's
she
to
stops
rob us.
focusing on her primary mission, which are the
Right.
supernatural graces that
Nerve. Yeah.
God sends us in order to elevate us into holiness. And what is holiness? Our participation in God's inner Trinitarian life, which is gifted to us in Christ through the Spirit, which we participate most fully in the Eucharist and the other sacraments. This is
Mm.
what we're called to, and this is not what the church is emphasizing. It might say these things in one hand, but it doesn't emphasize them. It doesn't make them real to people so that they see, as you said, their relevance, why I should care. And when the church herself doesn't act like she
Okay.
cares,
Okay.
as I wrote in my blog about, the de
Right.
facto atheism of the church with regard to the McCarrick affair, a church that covers up for priests that rape children is not a church that believes anything. And this is the church in which and I don't want to be too, apocalyptic here, but we need
Right.
to let that
Right.
sink in. That scores and scores of bishops, American and
Yeah.
otherwise, believed it
Well,
was
say it again. Say it again,
more
please. I mean, I
important
think
to
we.
save the reputation of the Father so and so or the church herself than to punish priests who raped children. And raped them repeatedly, and the bishop knew that this priest was raping children repeatedly, and simply moved them to a different parish where they raped children repeatedly again. These are not the actions of a believer. These are not the actions of someone who takes the faith seriously. These are the actions of a demonic fraud. As someone who's engaging in some kind of a kabuki theater, some sort of masquerade, some sort of sham.
That's right.
And it is a fraud which has been pushed upon the church by essentially Epicurean prelates who have all kinds of skeletons in their own closets in that regard, compromise themselves in that regard, who don't have the courage, therefore, to call us to courage because they don't have it themselves and they're not living it themselves. And they also then resent those traditional priests who actually
Well,
believe and
or the
call
inclin.
people. Why
Right.
is
No,
it
they
that?
don't have the
And I don't want to
courage.
get involved in like the Father Altman debate. I don't know any of these people in particular. I'm not
Yeah.
talking about. I don't have anybody in mind. I'm simply saying, in my anecdotal,
God.
subjective
Yeah.
experience, it is
Yeah.
more common for a very traditional
Yeah.
priest who wants to do certain things in his parish, like put up altar rails or pray ad orientem, to run afoul of his bishop than it is for a priest who will preach from the pulpit that gay marriage, whatever.
Yep.
All right. Look, James Martin is now the cause celeb of so many. Why is it that he gets away with that, whereas
Yep.
other priests of a more traditional
Yep.
bent don't? This is indicative to me of something that is rotten in the church right now.
Yeah, and that's long been my frustrations personally, and and I haven't always behaved well in terms of dealing with my anger about that hypocrisy and that skullduggery of that. But you know, it strikes me that not only do you have a ruling class in the church that has lost
Yes.
its eschatological nerve, you can say, as you were pointing out, that they've actually lost their faith in the evangel, right? You say that,
Yeah, pick one.
we need a different evangel. Well, we need one. We don't have any. We don't have any evangel other than sort of the
Yeah, I mean, our
surreptitious
evangel
playing
has
out of
got
my
to
dark
be. I mean, in
desires
the one
in
blog
in
post where I was
shadows
a
and
little bit
corners where
critical,
people
not a
can't
little bit,
see
a
it.
lot critical of the idea
How is
that
that a recipe
unless
for
we
a
have a
church?
fulsomely populated hell, we're not going to be able to avoid a fulsomely populated hell. Unless there's people in hell, we won't be able to keep people out of hell or whatever. I was kind of
Yeah,
making fun. It's a little satirical and kind of unfair, but it was making sort of my point that we don't need more hell cowbell. We don't need more emphasis on
yeah,
that. In terms of hell being this future place where God might send me
yeah,
or I might send myself as a result of yeah, as well, hell, typically there's retributive justice. I am going to be punished by God
that's a
for
better
my
way to say it.
sins in the order of retributive justice, but that's got a term to it. That's got a limit. If hell is going to be eternal, it's got to be me
Yep.
condemning myself, me refusing the offer of grace myself, and that is a
Yeah.
conversation we could have. But the new evangel that we should have isn't that hell doesn't exist and there's no potential for us to go there.
Well,
I'm often misunderstood,
yeah, and
and Balthazar's often misunderstood. No, it's entirely no. The new evangel. If you see what Saint Paul was preaching, he was
mhm,
preaching in a sense. He wasn't saying, "Believe this, or you're going to go to hell." He was saying, "Believe this, and you will come out of hell." We all live, and so in other words, this losing of the eschatological nerve cuts both ways,
right,
and not
right,
only robs
yeah.
us of the vision
That's
of
such a
heaven
such.
and therefore the heroism to come up higher, theosis, our divinization, our participation in God. It also robs us of the realization that we have intimations and foretastes of hell right now. And how many people live these quiet lives of desperation, these quiet lives of a lived hell, that
Yeah.
the gospel liberate. This was Paul's message. You
Right.
are you are beholden and
Absolutely.
enslaved to the
Well,
principalities and powers, to
but see,
Caesar, to the gods that you were talking of before, the strong.
yeah.
I'm here to tell you Christ has smashed all of those. So you can now come out of hell.
Right. And
Yes.
this goes right back to what we started talking about earlier about desire, right? The good news is so much about the transformation of desire, right? Dante is so good about this. It's like, look, Dante, and for the church, generally understood, hell is not,
Oh yeah.
sort of merely like a prison. It's like it's where you go because you want to be there, right? That you have so conformed yourself to desire of a, as you would say, a penultimate good, not the ultimate good, that you actually are honored in your choices, right? So what I think Paul is saying here is that you don't have to be a slave to your desires. You don't have to be a slave to these. You can actually reorient yourself to the summum bonum. That's a sort of Thomistic, right? But that we can actually change what we want. And if anybody has ever been through any kind of, sort of
Good for
self-improvement
you.
gig, or, I recently started, I've turned myself into a runner in the past year and a half since the COVID lockdowns. It's like, yeah, like I actually want to go running. I have been
Yeah.
a couch potato, from way back. And now I'm understanding that no, but I'm serious. I'm really serious about this. Like I actually now it's I get myself out of bed, I get my coffee, and I throw on my sneakers because I'm ready to go and I want to go. This is an absolute revelation to me because if you would have asked me 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, Kale, like, do you want to be a runner? I'd be look at you like you're crazy. No, thank you. I've got my cigarette and my coffee. I'm all set here. But we are so foolish to think that because I desire something on Tuesday that I'm always going to desire it. And I think that orienting ourselves, that eschatological nerve that you're talking about, is that have the nerve, have the heroism to want something more, to want something bigger, better than yourself. And guess what? We can do it with grace, of course. This is, and it's so sad to me to watch, my
Oh, this
students
is so
and my
true, and this
friends,
is one of the bad
that they
messages of our
just
culture. One of those
don't
scripts in
believe
our
that they
brains
can
that
refine their own
are the
desires.
desires that. And I mean, this is deep, deep waters here in our culture that simply are
Yeah,
that simply
yeah,
want to baptize our desires, especially our sexual desires, because you have these sexual desires. That means God made you this way. It means you are born with. They're natural, and any attempt to
of course,
domesticate your
right.
sexual desires is inherently repressive and horrible and terrible
Yeah,
and sex denying. We need to be sex positive, all right, and all that. And it is fatalism. It is pure fatalism, and nobody can. The good news is nobody can
but it's
ultimately live for
fatalism, Larry.
long,
It's pure
happily,
fatalism.
in such a regime. For example, one of the reasons why I can be critical of say our culture simply baptizing of the entire gay subculture is that I know a lot of people in the gay subculture. I actually know gay people, and I know what their lives are like, and I know what their lives are like, and I know what it is that they have endured and what it is they have suffered, and I have some very honest relationship with some gay friends of mine, and they're very open to the. They don't believe it, but they're very
Yeah,
open to the gospel, and because they understand the slavery dimension here that we're talking about, and
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Well, isn't that the
yeah,
great tragedy of June every year, right? I mean, in all compassion and all, and I'm not a rock thrower about this stuff. But it's so sad. It's become such a profoundly sad time for
yes,
me because I
It
am
is, and
watching people
like I
celebrate
said, I
their
am. This is
slavery.
not one of my hobby horses.
And
I'm
it's
not
it's
on the
it's a
sort of
hard thing to watch, Larry.
anti-gay
It's a really
bandwagon.
hard thing to
You know,
watch.
it's not. I don't believe it's godless homosexuals that are bringing down America.
Yeah, me
I don't.
neither.
I don't think that, and I have nothing but love and compassion for all of my gay friends, and I wouldn't want
Yeah, of
a
course.
hair on
Yeah.
their heads to be
No,
harmed
no,
by any bigot or fool.
no.
But nevertheless, the reason why I disagree with their lifestyle is I think it is
Hmm.
enslaving. I think it makes them unhappy. I think that
Of
it's a
course.
spiritual dead end that leads nowhere. And there is an old fashioned word that we used to use to
Yeah,
describe such behaviors. It's called sin. You know, sin causes us to hamartia, to miss the mark.
yeah,
Behavior that misses the mark. It's not what our sexuality is for.
yeah,
You know, but it points to what I mean by to the
yeah. Miss the
heroism of
mark. Miss the
holiness. It
mark.
doesn't
Yeah.
have to be some big thing like Achilles or some
Right,
epic Greek sort of Joan of Arc sort of thing. You know, in France, it can
right,
be that,
right.
but it can also
Yeah.
simply be. Yeah, I've known, for
I mean, it could
example,
be
a
that
few
too, but
morbidly
you're right.
obese
I think
people in
that
my life, and I mean
it scales
people
up
who
and
weighed
down because
400,
it's a
500
paradigm.
kind of pounds obese, and who were so not because they
Hmm.
just couldn't,
Hmm.
they just liked to eat and they just ate. No, because they had psychological problems.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because eating was a way of self medicating for them because of some abuse they had suffered as a child or some trauma they had
Yeah,
undergone, a
yeah.
lost relationship or something.
Soothing,
And
soothing.
they
Yeah.
self medicated with food and over. And then these people lost like 300 pounds. They used their faith in Christ, the sacraments, and decided, like you decided to become a runner, they decided,
Wow.
I'm going to lose 300 pounds and I'm going to stop this cycle. It's not the weight as such that they were battling, but the psychological demons, the
Yeah.
hell that they were in that put them in those
Right.
overweight bodies to begin with.
Right.
That
Of
is
course.
a form of heroism, and it is a
Right.
form of Christological liberation because they did so specifically out of the
Right.
stance
Right.
of fidelity to Christ, of faith. Lord, what do you want me to do with my life? And moved on from there. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, heroism doesn't have to be a Maximilian Kolbe style martyrdom. It can be
Yeah.
many, many things far more hidden from the world. Yes.
Yeah. And look, 99.9% of the time, that's precisely what it is. Very few, look, there's a reason why we know who
Yeah.
Maximilian Kolbe is because he had extraordinary heroic virtue and self sacrifice. God bless him. I mean, honestly, St. Maximilian Kolbe, pray for us, really. But for us, for those of us who live in this sort of ordo of apathy, our versions of heroism could be as seemingly mundane as looking at your crying daughter
Right.
who is
Right.
desperate to fit in with her
Yeah.
friends and wants you to give her Instagram and you say, honey, I love you, but no, which is what happened to me 2 nights ago. And it's not because I'm a jerk. It's because I know that Instagram for a 14-year-old person is a weapon that will be used against her psyche. I know it. I work with kids every day of my life,
Of
and
course
I'm
you
sitting
did.
there, and I'm not trying to polish my halo here, but in that moment, I wanted to say yes, Larry. I wanted to say, honey, you can have it. Of course, you can have it. And but I'm sitting there thinking like, no, I
I
can't.
know
I
when I'm
can't
out in
lie.
yeah,
I can't lie,
when I'm out
and
in
I owe this
public,
to my daughter
and I don't want to
to
be
say
judgmental
no,
here
not
because I
now.
wasn't
No,
a
now is
perfect
not
parent.
good. It's
But when
not
I
good.
see,
And
say, at a grocery
that's
store, a
heroism.
mom walking with two kids like ages 8 or 10, and they both have smartphones in their hands,
Yeah,
and I'm saying to myself, that's not good. I'm not going to say that's a bad parent. I'm saying whatever your other qualities are as a parent, this is not good.
yeah,
Okay? Because
yeah,
you have just put into the hands of your
yeah,
child
yeah,
the most demonic thing that you could place in their lives right now. So no, it's an act of heroism. And for a parent to have to say
yeah,
to their 10-year-old who comes home, I know we all know this. You
yeah,
don't want your child to feel like a misfit. You don't want your child to feel like a pariah or bullied or that they're made fun of. You don't want that. And so that they're weird. But
right.
you know what?
Yeah, or they're weird. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I've come, look, I've come to actively preaching, not preaching, but chatting and talk with my kids. Like, yeah,
yep.
we're weird. I'm not, and I'm not sorry about it, but we're weird. And, look, I'm here. I want to talk to you. And daddy and mommy have reasons for this, and it's because we love you, but we're weird. And, you just have to pray for the strength to withstand. Look, I mean,
Especially
the
tears of a daughter
of a
to a
child
daddy.
in that situation, are acidically powerful.
Daddy's little girl gets whatever she wants. Dads are the most indulgent fools ever
Amen.
to their sweet
oh
little
my
daughters.
God.
I know I was
Amen.
with my daughter.
It's
She
brutal.
turned out happily, thank God, but
Yeah.
not in spite of my
Yeah.
parenting, not because of it. Because yeah,
Yeah. That's
yeah,
good. God
absolutely.
bless.
But you know
God
what?
bless.
To bring it back to what we were talking about,
Pray for those of us
here
who
we're
are still
talking
in the
about parenting,
throes.
but
We're
is
still
that
in
not what
the
the
we're
church
still in the
is?
cauldron of it all.
And for the church to therefore simply be indulgent
Yeah.
in this profligate way to everybody say, oh, let's let everybody come to
Yeah, that's
communion.
right.
It doesn't matter. Oh, you're in favor of slavery? Come up to communion anyway. Oh, prenatal homicide? Come up to
Right.
communion anyway. It doesn't matter. In fact, any bishop that would deny you communion for wanting
Right.
to murder children, we're going to go after him.
Right. Right.
I'm not even
Fine.
being
Yeah.
hyperbolic here.
Right.
I'm not being satirical. That really, what those 60 signatories did to Archbishop,
Right.
sending that letter saying
That's right.
we shouldn't even be talking about this, lest we be perceived as
Yeah.
political. That was the most political move of all, right there. That's the irony.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
You can only be political.
exactly.
You can only be political or a culture warrior one way,
Yeah.
Larry. You should know
I mean,
this by
this,
now. Other
Cardinal
people are
Supich was one
pure
of the
as the
leaders of
driven
this, of course,
snow,
when he
and
was
they
bishop out
love
in
the
Seattle. He
gospel of
forbade
Jesus.
his
It's
priests
only
from
those
even
nasty
protesting
culture
outside of
warriors,
abortion clinics.
So
So one begins to wonder right there, what, what is his fidelity to the church's teaching about human life? He obviously doesn't take it seriously.
what a what a weird thing. Honestly, I know this is. Yeah.
And yet,
I
yet
mean, I know this is not
yeah,
what
you're
we're
not
talking
talking
about
about
today,
priests who were,
but that's just
throwing
so
water
weird,
balloons at
Larry. I mean, like, what a
passersby.
weird thing. I
You were
mean,
talking about
it's not
priests who
weird,
were
right?
standing
It's
there praying a
painfully
rosary,
obvious.
quietly praying a rosary with other rosary. And Supich denied his priests that right on the ground, said, well, it would be perceived as overly political. As if
Pray,
abortion is
yeah.
only a political and partisan issue and not a fundamental human life issue. So, yeah, when you have a church, when you have a church that promotes men like that, and Tobin and McElroy and Farrell, and when you have a church
But
that promotes those
parenting is
guys into
political.
height,
You know
then
this,
you know
Larry.
something bad is happening. Something bad is happening.
Yeah, of course. But as I'm learning more and more as I sort of sift through all of this, it's like I can't let that stuff. Look, I should pay attention to it because I have a brain and I have a voice and
That's
I
right.
have a platform and I'm going to talk about it. But I can't. I have to not allow that to displace my own call, my own calling to be holy, to be heroic,
Yeah. Because,
and to
rage
look
baiting
for
is real.
things to
And the sad
build
thing
me
is
up
we
in
can
my
rage bait
own,
ourselves.
path
Uh,
to
yeah,
martyrdom.
yeah. I'm great at rage
That
baiting
that
myself. As anybody who's reading my blog or watch this show will know,
yeah.
I can work myself up into a pretty good froth.
Well,
Now,
you and I
some
are great
rage
at
is
it.
justified. Sometimes righteous indignation is
Yeah,
justified. But you're absolutely correct. Our message
yeah,
has to remain positive, which is why on this particular episode
yeah.
we haven't led with the
Sure.
negative. We've been very positive about what it is the church should be proposing. Uh, but the point is, the flip side, you do have to talk about the negative a little bit
Yeah.
because that's what stands in the way of the positive proposal.
Right. Right. You know, I want to recommend right now
Oh yeah,
a movie to our viewers and listeners. It's a Pixar movie called Wall-E, and it's a really it's a fantastic movie, and I really believe that it captures not only the sort of the mendacity, the potential mendacities of unchecked capitalism. I think that's pretty clear and pretty obvious. And you don't have to be a raging left winger to understand the problems of that, or you shouldn't have to be. We can all recognize that. But I really think it captures the dangers of what Neil Postman said many, many years ago, that we are in danger of amusing ourselves to death. And it's such a perfect image of these people that are on a bark, right? They're on a ship, and instead of being called to heroism, every wish, every desire is fulfilled. And so what are they? They're a bunch of slugs floating around on propelled lazy boys. And if that's not an image of the sort of bourgeois,
great suggestion. I watched that movie
de
one time on a
facto
flight
atheism,
to Rome, I think,
or the Ordo of Apathy,
and
I don't
thought
know
the
what
same
is.
thing.
So I think it's well worth your time.
I would, since we're recommending things, I would recommend to your viewers C.S. Lewis's great little book called The Great Divorce, which isn't about divorce. It's about the divorce between heaven and hell.
Yeah.
And it's a fantasy, fictional story of people who take a bus ride from hell up into the foreground of heaven and are, in a sense, being greeted by angelic visitors trying to convince them to choose heaven. And it's part of Lewis's theme that people choose hell. The doors of hell are locked from the inside. And so here they're given every chance to go to heaven. And every single person that took the bus ride to heaven, except for one, chose to go back to hell. And the conversations wherein they justify their return is the genius of Lewis's book, where it shows us that we all, in very significant ways that seem insignificant, are in a sense creating hell within us as every single day, with all the small lies we tell ourselves, the rationalizations. And so it's a great book.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And the insight that I've taken from that book, I think I read that book when I was 20, a recent revert back to the faith. And I remember just profoundly, just the profundity of recognizing, as he says, when we die, we don't change. In other words, what we have been spending our entire preseason training for is what we are. And those are not his words; they're my words, of course. But so whatever it is you spent the 40, 50, 80 years that most of us are given on this planet, whatever it is we've been doing, practicing being, is what we'll be. And therefore, going back to this theme, I realize that the theme of desire has emerged out of our conversation here today. But what we desire becomes it constitutes who we are or who we will be.
Oh yeah,
that's it. That's right. And I think that that's important, and it's something that I try to recognize as I struggle with my own sins and my own weaknesses and my own desires for pleasure or comfort or whatever it may be. I need to prepare myself for the thing, and that's why I believe that heroism as our archetype and as our model is so important. And look, I mean, what else is more profound than Jesus himself, in the Garden of Gethsemane, asking the Father for this cup to pass. I mean, if Jesus is allowed to ask for this cup to pass, then I think we're allowed those prayers as well. But significantly, he also says,
it's not a kind of sadistic,
your will be done.
Sort of wallowing in
my
suffering
friends,
for the sake of suffering.
Is the
we're
real
allowed
deal.
to pray not to suffer. Yeah.
Just like you want your daughter, you want what is great and best for your daughter. God, of course, as you say in your piece, like I want a God who cares
so that's
enough,
perfect.
Who has a design for me. If he doesn't have a design for me, if he doesn't care, then I don't want anything to do with him. All right. Well, look, Larry, I know you are
No problem.
probably have a ton of things to do before you take off for vacation. I want to thank you for giving me this hour, almost hour and
Sure.
15 minutes of your time today. But this has been great. And look, I look forward to our next one, whatever that'll be. And
Yeah, it's
two
a
things,
series of
housekeeping
Barons
bits here.
called
Number
Bishop
one,
Barron Presents,
Larry,
and
you
it's
are
from
going to
the
be
Word on
on
Fire
a show
Studios
with
out
Bishop
in
Barron coming
Santa
up. Can you
Barbara,
just tell us a little
California.
quickly about that?
And there's an interviewer, and then there's Barron and a guest. And the interviewer asked Barron and the guests sort of similar questions. I just saw one. He had Sohrab Ahmari
Mm-hmm.
uh, on there. That was the first one, and so I mean, Robert George is going to be one, and then eventually,
Great.
then me. Uh, I'd say, well,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess my longtime friendship with Barron is paying off in some sense because, yes, it's like
Look at
the
you,
Sesame
Larry.
Street thing. One
Look
of
at
these
you
things is
stepping
not
up.
like
I
the
love
other.
it. I love
You
it.
know, Robert George and all these other famous, and then Larry Chap that nobody's ever
That's
heard
right.
of
That's
really
right.
is going to
Wh-
be
wh-
on this show. So it's great. I'm very flattered, and it's just going to be a lot of fun and should help also. The first week of August is when it's taping. They're flying me out there for that. When it actually will go on YouTube and be aired, I don't
when is
really
that?
know.
When
But
is
that's
that
when
going to
it's getting
happen?
taped, first week of August.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, we
I've
will
never
be
been to Santa
sure
Barbara.
to
I'll tell you what, so I'm looking forward
alert
to the
everybody when that,
conversation
that is
because
coming out.
I'm being
That's
invited
pretty
because
exciting
of my
news. Santa
blog,
Barbara is
and
beautiful. I don't know if you've ever been out
many
there, but it's a
people
really a
at Word
special
on
place. It's
Fire
actually,
read my blog and
yeah,
really
yeah,
enjoy a lot of what
yeah.
I'm saying. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity
Sure, of
to have a
course.
give and take with Bishop Barron about some of the things like you and I were talking
Yeah,
about in our last episode. What about this? What about that? And interesting to get his take on things.
great. Yeah, 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 yeah. No, it's very exciting. I'm really glad you're doing it. So, people, if you could like and subscribe this, I do my show, my weekly show with Rod at the American Conservative, but I'm doing some more shows. I'll be doing some more interviews and shows here on my own channel. So, if you could
Oh,
like and
thanks,
subscribe and all that
Kale. You
nice stuff,
too.
it would help me out.
Bye
So,
bye.
all right. Well, until then, Larry, have a great one, and everybody else, God bless, or God bless you too, Larry. I'm sorry, I don't mean to exclude you from that. Yeah. All right. Take care, man. Bye bye.